Picture two cities on the same day, 3,000 years ago. Both are burning, both watching their kings flee and their gods fall silent. Yet 100 years later, one of them is alive again, its streets loud with new voices, while the other is nothing but a scorched mound in the dirt, its very name lost so completely that we had to dig it out of the ground to remember it ever existed. Same fire, same collapse. Two completely different endings. Why? That question sits at the heart of one of history's darkest puzzles. Civilizations are not permanent. They rise, they shine, and sometimes they come apart with terrifying speed, shedding their cities, their rulers, their writing, and even their gods in the space of a single lifetime. But here is the strange part. Some of them claw their way back from the edge of oblivion. Others simply disappear, leaving behind only ruins and riddles for us to argue over. And the difference between those two fates is almost never luck. Historians have spent entire careers tracing the pattern, and what they have found should make you look at your own world a little differently. Start with the biggest collapse the ancient world ever knew. Around the year 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was a glittering, connected place. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, the merchant kingdoms of the Levant. They traded copper and tin, wrote letters to one another, exchanged gold and princesses and threats. It was, in its way, the first international system. And then, in the span of a few decades, almost all of it burned. City after city was destroyed. Mycenae, Pylos, Ugarit, Hattusa, Troy. Trade routes snapped. Whole writing systems were forgotten. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and for a long time it was blamed on a mysterious enemy the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. But the truth is messier and scarier. It was a perfect storm. Drought that lasted decades, earthquakes, famine, internal revolt, and the fragile web of trade that tied everyone together, so that when one kingdom fell, it dragged its neighbors down with it. It was a networked world, and the network became the wound. Now watch what happened next, because this is where the fates split. Consider Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the coast of what is now Syria. When the end came, a scribe was pressing wet clay with an urgent message, begging for help, warning that enemy ships had been sighted and the city's own forces were away. The tablet was still in the fire when Ugarit fell. It was never sent because there was no one left to send it to, and no one ever came back to rebuild. Ugarit simply ended. Archaeologists found that final letter baked hard by the very flames that destroyed the city, a message frozen mid-sentence for 3,000 years. That is what a true vanishing looks like. Now look at the Hittites, who ruled a vast empire across Anatolia from their mountain capital of Hattusa, a city of stone lions and massive gates. When their world collapsed, the royal family fled, the capital was abandoned and burned, and the Hittite Empire, a superpower that had once fought Egypt to a standstill, evaporated. The language died. The kings were forgotten so thoroughly that for thousands of years, people reading old texts saw references to the Hittites and assumed they were some small local tribe, never guessing they had once been an empire that shook the ancient world. A whole civilization slipped clean out of human memory. But Egypt? Egypt bent and did not break. It was battered. It lost territory, wealth, and stability, and it slid into a long, painful decline. But the kingdom itself survived, and the reason is instructive. Egypt had the Nile, a river that flooded on a predictable schedule and made farming reliable even when trade collapsed and the wider world went dark. It had a deep, centralized administration and a culture so cohesive that Egyptians knew, in their bones, what it meant to be Egyptian. When the storm passed, there was still a core to return to, an identity and a food supply that let the society regroup and carry on. Environment, cohesion, and institutions carried it through the fire. And then there is Greece, which gives us the most hopeful lesson of all. When the Mycenaean palaces fell, Greece plunged into a genuine dark age. The population crashed. The grand stone citadels were abandoned, and most striking of all, the Greeks forgot how to write. The script they had used, which we call Linear B, simply disappeared from use for something like 400 years. Think about that. A literate society became illiterate. If you had stood in the ruins of Mycenae around 1050 BC, you would have bet everything that this was the end of the story. But it wasn't the end. It was a pause. Slowly, over centuries, Greece rebuilt, and it did not rebuild the same. It came back transformed. The Greeks borrowed an alphabet from Phoenician traders and made it their own, adding vowels and creating one of the most flexible writing systems in history. They invented a new kind of political community, the polis, the city-state. Out of that dark age eventually came Homer, philosophy, democracy, drama, a civilization that would shape the entire Western world. The collapse didn't just get survived, it cleared the ground for a reinvention. So what actually makes the difference? Why does one society come back stronger while another disappears without a trace? When you line up the cases, a handful of factors keep showing up again and again. The first is adaptability, the willingness to become something new instead of clinging to what was lost. Rigid societies built around a single divine king or one fragile way of doing things tend to shatter when that one thing breaks. Flexible societies bend, they improvise. When the Greeks lost their palace bureaucracies, they didn't try to rebuild god kings on the old model. They built something completely different, and that new form turned out to be far more resilient than the thing it replaced. The second is trade and connection, and this one cuts both ways, which is exactly what makes it so interesting. Deep trade networks make a civilization rich and resilient in good times, spreading resources, ideas, and technology across the whole system. But they also breed fragility. The more connected you are, the harder you fall when the network collapses. Because you have specialized, you have grown dependent, you have forgotten how to make the things you used to simply import. The Bronze Age world was so interdependent that it toppled like a row of dominoes. The trick, it seems, is connection without total dependence. The third factor is institutions and knowledge, specifically whether the things that make a society work can survive the loss of its leaders. Writing is the great example. A civilization that writes down its laws, its stories, its techniques can lose a king and still keep its mind. One that keeps everything locked in the heads of a small elite loses everything when that elite is killed or scattered. This is exactly why the Greek Dark Age was so dark. The knowledge lived inside the palaces, and when the palaces burned, the knowledge burned with them. The fourth is environment and climate, the silent hand behind so many collapses. Again and again, when we drill into ancient lake beds and read the pollen and the sediment layer by layer, we find the same grim signature underneath a fallen civilization: drought. The Bronze Age collapse lines up with a brutal, prolonged dry spell, and a society's fate often hinged on whether its environment offered a second chance, a reliable river, a workable climate, or whether it had already stripped its land bare and had nothing left to fall back on. Environment can also be a trap a society lays for itself. Think of Rapa Nui, the remote Pacific island we call Easter Island, famous for its silent, stone giants staring out at the sea. The old story says its people cut down every last tree, wrecked their own ecosystem, and collapsed into ruin. A tidy parable about destroying the world beneath your feet. Scholars now argue the real story was more complicated, with foreign diseases and slave raids doing terrible damage after Europeans arrived. But the deeper point survives the debate. An isolated society with nowhere to run and no network to fall back on lives on a razor-thin margin. When you are alone in the middle of an ocean, there is no neighbor to trade with, no empire to rebuild you, no second chance waiting over the horizon. Isolation can doom you as surely as any invading army. Which brings us to one of the most debated cases of all, the Maya. You have probably heard that the Maya mysteriously vanished, and it makes for a great story. Jungles swallowing pyramids, cities emptied overnight. In the southern lowlands, the great classic cities like Tikal and Copan really were abandoned, and drought, warfare, and overpopulation all seem to have played their part. But here is the twist the popular story leaves out. The Maya did not vanish. Millions of Maya people are alive today, speaking Mayan languages, farming the same land their ancestors did. What collapsed was a particular political system of divine kings and monumental cities, not the people and not the culture. It is a crucial distinction. Sometimes what looks like a vanishing is really a transformation, a society shedding a skin it could no longer wear. Compare that with a civilization that really does seem to have slipped away. The Indus Valley, or Harappan civilization, 4,500 years ago. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated cultures on Earth, with carefully planned cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, standardized bricks, and advanced drainage, bathrooms and sewers that put much later cities to shame. And then, over centuries, the great cities were abandoned, the population dispersed, and the civilization faded. Its writing has never been deciphered. We have their symbols and cannot read a single word, so their thoughts are locked away from us forever. No triumphant rebuilding, no clear successor empire, shifting rivers, a changing climate, and the loss of trade all seem to have played a role. The Indus is closer to a true fading, not a violent death, but a slow dissolving into silence. Now, some civilizations don't just survive one collapse. They turn coming back from the dead into a way of life. China is the masterclass. Over more than 2,000 years, China fell apart again and again. Dynasties crumbled, invaders poured across the borders, the country split into warring pieces. And yet, time after time, it reassembled itself into a single, unified empire. Why? Because it held onto the things that let it rebuild. A shared writing system that bound together people who spoke wildly different languages. A professional bureaucracy that could run the state no matter who happened to be sitting on the throne. And a powerful idea, the deep conviction that China was meant to be one. Rulers came and went, but the blueprint for putting the pieces back together was never lost. Collapse became a chapter, not an ending. Rome tells a subtler version of the same story. We say Rome fell, and in the West, its political structure genuinely did. The emperors vanished, the great cities shrank, the roads cracked and grassed over. But Rome's ideas refused to die. Its law became the foundation of European legal systems. Its language, Latin, evolved into French and Spanish and Italian and lived on for centuries in the church. And in the East, the Roman Empire didn't fall at all in the year 476. It carried on for another 1,000 years as what we now call the Byzantine Empire. Rome, in a sense, had been written too deeply into the world to fully disappear. Its body died, but its DNA was scattered everywhere. And that points to maybe the deepest lesson of all. The civilizations that survive collapse are often the ones whose essence had become portable, carried not in a single city or a single king, but in something you can take with you when the walls come down. Consider the Jewish people. whose temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, who were driven from their land, and who, by every ancient rule, should have dissolved into the surrounding cultures the way countless other conquered peoples did. They didn't. They survived for 2,000 years without a state, without a temple, without a homeland, because their civilization had been encoded into text, law, memory, and ritual. A portable homeland you could carry in a book and hand to your children anywhere on Earth. When your identity lives in ideas rather than in stone, the stone can fall and you remain. So look again at those two burning cities from the very beginning. What separated the one that rose from the ashes from the one that simply became ash? It was rarely the size of the fire. It was what each city had built before the fire ever came. Whether it was adaptable or rigid, whether its knowledge was written down or locked in a few fragile heads, whether its people shared an identity strong enough to regroup around, whether its land offered a second chance, and whether the thing that made it itself could outlive the loss of everything physical. Here is the thought I want to leave you with. We tend to imagine that collapse is the opposite of survival, that a civilization either endures or it dies, and that is the whole story. But history whispers something stranger and, in its own way, more hopeful. Collapse is not the opposite of survival, it is the test of it. Every civilization, including our own, will eventually face its hour in the fire, and the only question that has ever really mattered is what you have made portable, what wisdom, what knowledge, what bonds you have written deeply enough that they can walk out of the ruins and begin again. The cities that vanished are not proof that the end is inevitable. They are reminders that what you carry with you is the only thing that ever truly lasts.